This review is a sequel to my video on One Piece Grand Battle. I'd encourage that you watch that video if you haven't already, in order to have full context. The story behind One Piece Grand Adventure is a stark contrast to One Piece Grand Battle. Where much of Battle's content was censored or cut for its non-Japanese release, in some ways Adventure was actually more content-rich than anything Japan got. Grand Adventure was built for a North American audience. It's much like the Game Boy Advance One Piece game in that way. It's a SKU that never hit the land of the rising sun, but instead used assets from those Japanese titles to make something new. That's also why the key art is just a few notches edgier than anything you'll find in the game itself. It's actually reused box art from Fighting for One Piece, a more conventional 2D fighter that didn't cross the Pacific. But for our Grand series, Adventure has a larger roster, new modes, and a few small gameplay tweaks that might make it the closest thing to a definitive release this franchise has ever gotten. It still lacks some of the characters and levels that Grand Battle Rush had, but conversely this title also had ones that Rush didn't. It's an ironic and extreme sharp turn from the localization that Battle went through, and that's for the better. The title of this sequel being neither Grand Battle 2 nor replacing Battle with a synonymous noun reveals its shift in priority, at least from a single-player perspective. Adventuring is the new gameplay mode, and it's now your primary method of unlocking new characters, compared to the fighting arcade mode that's present in all Grand Battle titles prior, Japanese or otherwise. The battling is still the focus here, and it's the primary way that most of the scenarios play out, but the Grand Adventure serves as the connective framework that links these battles together. You start as Luffy, and will be presented with a mostly linear map with a few decision points along the way. Each node on the map correlates to either a battle against a CPU opponent, a minigame, or some fighting-based objective like killing waves of smaller foes. You'll progress through the story of One Piece and gather more characters as you advance that can be used in the fights. There's even an RPG-like leveling system where your character starts out with really low stats, but as you fight and gain experience, you can distribute points to enhance them. Some fights even have modifiers to differentiate themselves. A completed adventure as Luffy and crew unlocks increasingly escalating challenges in the form of new campaigns, some of which are villain point of view side stories, and others are new adventures unique to the game. You can even bring your leveled characters into other modes if you're so inclined. The Grand Adventuring is by no means the best part of this game, but it's considerably higher effort than I remember it being. The map itself isn't enough of a factor to really warp how the game is played, it's more of a fancy menu than an actual strategic addition. The real decision points come in the form of which characters you want to focus on leveling and how you're going to level them. But the adventure is in service to the real reason to play this title, the unsurprising focus that it shares with all of its predecessors, battling. In most ways, Grand Adventure has combat that is identical to Grand Battle. It's still the same whimsical, cartoony, Looney Tunes style of combat that emphasizes random items and knocking your opponents into stage hazards. But there's a few additional mechanics that add depth here. Your energy meter, which previously could only be used for special attacks and summoning companions, now has a tertiary use as a defensive tool. Meter can be expended to cancel combos, and additional depletion of that meter rewards you with increased buffs to launch a counterattack, like additional damage or speed right after the cancel. It's a simple 2-button combo that's the same across all characters, and it adds a nice bit of decision making to the otherwise simple combat. It's a great inclusion. More items are in play this time too, as well as an entire new item class, melee items, and it took their inclusion for me to realize that they weren't a thing this whole time. Lightsabers and bats can now be used to bludgeon your opponents with a button dedicated to swinging. This swing button can be used with all items, even ones you wouldn't conventionally want to swing, like bombs. Containers can be swung too, and successfully making contact while striking with one will automatically equip the item inside, making it a great alternative to throwing if you can risk going in close. The swing button replaced the lob button, but lobs aren't gone entirely. Instead, they have to be executed while in the air. This change makes them less effective as an anti-air tool, but also the prevalence of jumping is slightly diminished here to compensate. Previously, landing on your opponent's head would shave off some of their special meter and allow you to scoop it up for yourself. Grand Adventure still allows you to do this, just with the added stipulation of needing to accelerate your momentum downward with the right trigger first. It makes the technique more deliberate, harder to pull off, and consequently just a bit less desirable. This is probably the only change to the core gameplay that I wouldn't consider a net positive. In my last video, I praised this mechanic as being a small but impactful quirk of Grand Battle that gave it some of its cartoony flair. I'm glad it's not entirely gone, but I do understand why the team reworked it, with lobs being a bit more conditional this time. Where Grand Adventure transcends interesting localization project and becomes a truly definitive entry in the series in its own right, is in its content. Licensed fighting games have as much value as video games as they do virtual toy boxes where fan-favorite characters can be smashed against each other, so roster is a big deal. Grand Adventure features a total of 24 characters, which, numbers-wise, makes it tied with Grand Battle 2, but a moderate increase from the 16 to 19 that all the other 3D games had. The difference in math mostly comes down to the fact that Grand Adventure has a few unique characters that Japan didn't. Wapol makes his 3D debut having been away from the series since the PS1, and he's none the worse for it. I tried really examining these adventure-exclusive characters to spot any trends that indicate they were last-minute or cobbled-together additions, but I really couldn't. They've all got the same quantity and quality of moves, animations, and voice lines. Sure, there's a reskin here or there, but Kuina practically has Oda's blessing to be one as far as I'm concerned. Some of the characters stand out less from a technical perspective than they do a localization one. I suspect a shift in priorities happened somewhere during development. This level here probably looks a bit weird for any One Piece enthusiast. This giant in the background is Brogy, and he definitely didn't sail the seas on pirate ships during the present time we met him in the One Piece story in chapter 115. His inclusion here is actually because it's supposed to be the character Big Pan, whose first appearance was almost 200 chapters later in 309, that 4Kids never got to. This is supposed to be Foxy's pirate ship, and here's what the level looks like in Grand Battle Rush. But publisher Bandai probably swapped out some of these assets here for characters that 4Kids actually dubbed, even if it makes a bit less sense. But if that's the case, that logic wasn't consistently applied throughout the entire game. Eneru, Ohm, their supports, and the entire level of the Arc Maxim are all from the Skypiea storyline that 4Kids never got to, yet they are included in the game no problem. They hardly feel like oversights because Eneru is actually featured on the cover art too. Bandai didn't go all the way, we still don't have Foxy or Aokiji, but I'll take what I can get, and the presence of other new characters helps soften that blow quite a bit. There's also a handful of more stages, but more importantly is the fact that each stage also gets a modified secondary version that either switches up the weather, time of day, or season, and even changes up the stage hazards. It's a bit of aesthetic and mechanical variation while using mostly the same assets, and I think it does help break up some of the monotony of the same stages being your arena over and over. It's nice to have more. Having more is Grand Adventure's key component for me. The actual adventuring is interesting, but I could take or leave it. The changes to the battling are mostly good, if minor, but there's no ignoring the fact that the roster is 50% larger than what North America got last time. There's so much here that we didn't get before. There's so much here that Japan didn't get before, that this game's existence almost feels like an apology from the publisher for localizing only half the game last time. And if that's the case, apology accepted.